Record.
Mhm.
And we are recording. So, hi, Kerri. It's good to see you. We work together, but in this moment, I'm interviewing you almost 4 years, a little over 4 years after I first interviewed you. You were the second interview we did for Courageous Parents Network.
Seems like a long time ago.
Well, 4 years is a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was in the summer of 2013. So how shortly after, how much previous had it been that Kai died?
Kai died in November of 2012, so not quite a year.
You hadn't hit any of the milestones yet.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
can you, because you are you and you are so thoughtful about all of this, in a way that is, you're both the parent experiencing it, but also you're sort of the professional watching yourself experience it. I'm curious if you can articulate how you would describe the progression of those 4 years, including what it felt like to go through the 1-year anniversary and now how you reflect on where you were then and what that felt like.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, and still now, I guess, I'm now about a month away from the 5-year. So I think, what I learned early on is that the anticipation of those days are really sort of the worst part of it. And I had heard that from other people, but I think that first year I really didn't believe it because, I don't know, there's just no context. So you just think that day is going to be the worst day. But I think now I really know and kind of fear more like the days leading up to it as being the more overwhelming time, and the day itself is just kind of goes by. And but I think for me it was really hard in the beginning, the first year especially, and after that as well, but especially the first year, just trying to figure out what to do on those days was really difficult for me, because by then I had gotten divorced from Kai's dad and was living on my own with friends, and no other siblings. So it was just there was no sort of guidance as to like, what do I do on that day? And when I would talk to other bereaved friends who were going through it at a similar time, they would ask the kids, they would talk with their husband, they would like figure it out as a family, do things that their child liked doing, or eat things that their child liked eating. But I didn't really have any of that, and that was really, really hard for the first couple of years. It's still hard. I've accepted more now that like I don't have to do anything on those days. It doesn't have to be like this pressure that it felt in the first couple of years. And I think it was also really hard for my family to figure out what to do on those days because I couldn't direct them, and my instinct was like, I'll just deal with it myself because that's just the way I am. But that felt difficult for them because they didn't want to just not show up. But I wasn't giving them any outlet as to like how they could show up that would be okay for me. So the first couple of years, I just accepted that I'm just going to need to spend those days by myself. And each year since, it's actually been totally different. Whatever I do on that day has been different, and I've come to like accept that. Whereas some of my friends have like these traditions that they've built, doing the same thing every year. I've just accepted that that's not going to be our way, and that I'm just going to have to figure it out each year. And sometimes that's going for a walk in the woods, and sometimes that's visiting a friend in the hospital, or bringing cupcakes and just not showing, like just doing something and not being there. So it's been different every year. This 5-year now is coming up, and so now I feel like this additional pressure of like, what do I do about that? And do you do something about that? And what would that look like? So I still haven't figured that out. We're about 3 weeks away from the 5-year.
Have you have you ever had a moment where you said, wow, I didn't do that anniversary well? Like, have you actually thought, I let myself down? Because if you haven't, I'm thinking then there you go.
That's
It's
right. Yeah, I don't feel as pressured anymore to like figure it out. I think the 5 year is just hard because of it's 5 years, and that's like a long time, and that's like a lifetime. That's twice his lifetime. So, and it's just like a marker, and so that becomes like its own thing. So no, I don't really ever feel like, oh, I wish I had done something different. But I do think for me that because I've like learned to control the anticipation part of it, because I know that's coming. Now there's like this weird letdown, I think, afterwards, where I'm like, okay, well, there goes another year, and I didn't really figure this out still. But I mean, I don't feel bad about it, but it is kind of like a weird letdown in some way, I guess.
No, that makes total sense. I mean, I have I have children and a husband with which we do some rituals, and yet I have very much still always some of the same feelings.
Yeah.
So some of that I think is natural, but you raise a really big point about, Kai was he is your only child. And when I interviewed you 4 years ago, I was too afraid to ask you about that.
Okay.
And I'm still a little nervous to ask you about that because it just strikes me as especially mean. Like, it's mean no matter what, but I think it's like really mean. And maybe you don't want to talk about that, but knowing that maybe hopefully other families will be watching, parents will be watching, if there's anything you would say about that you'd be willing to share.
Yeah. I think even as Kai was dying, and certainly the year after, a lot of people would ask me about, when are you going to have another kid? Are you going to? Even when Kai was sick and, getting divorced shortly after, that conversation sort of shifted, but not really. People still just think, go have another baby. Like, it's so easy, which was really frustrating for a while. I mean, the intentions are good, and I understood that part of it, but I wasn't in a position to even be making that decision at that time. So it was really hard to answer that question at that time. Over the years, I think in the first couple of years, I was still really identified myself, and other people identified me as Kai's mom. And that happens a lot less now, which is a weird shift. I think, by year 3, my identity didn't lead with I'm Kai's mom anymore. Even when other people would still acknowledge it, I didn't feel it anymore because I've now not been parenting for 3 years. And so that's, a very different thing. Yes, Kai will always be my child, but for me, I didn't identify as a parent anymore. And I will say, like, now people hardly ever ask me that, and people hardly ever ask if I have children at all, which I kind of feels a little bit weird, because for a couple of years, random strangers who knew nothing about my situation would ask all the time. So I don't know if I'm like putting off some weird vibe of like, I don't have kids, or I do know for me, like, it was hard for me to be around other kids for a couple of years. And so that probably has a lot to do with it. I wasn't living the life where I was in those situations with other parents that much. And that was pretty intentional. It was not a place that I felt comfortable for a couple of years. I mean, when I've had this conversation with friends and family, they don't understand it because I work with kids. So when I would say, like, I don't really hang out with kids anymore, they would be like, but you work with kids all day long. So it's like kind of confusing. But socially, and certainly with my friends who had kids that were the same age that Kai would have grown up with, I really avoided all of them for until about now. I'm just starting to re-enter their lives. And thankfully, many of them are still there. So that's nice.
I think you would be hard to not be friends with anymore. How do you do a thing where you see a thought? How old would Kai be? Kai would be seven.
Mm-hmm.
Do you look at 7-year-olds and say that would be Kai, or do you not do that?
I think I do it a lot less now. I think when it was year 1 and 2, and I could, his peers still were 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and still little babies and little people. It was a lot more of like, oh, that would be our life right now. And now that it's been almost 5 years, and the difference between a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old is such a great difference that it's really hard for me to imagine that at this point. It still comes up a little bit when I see the kids that were born with him, and, you know, my friends who I hung out with at the time, when I see their 7-year-olds, I'm like, wow, that's a whole different life. That is something that I really know nothing about. But I don't necessarily, in my mind, like put him as a 7-year-old. Like, it's such a far jump for me that and because I think I don't have any other kids, like 2 to 7, it's like I've just never experienced that. So I have no idea what that would be like. So I still see him as a 2-year-old.
I still see Cameron as a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
So I'm not as good on Facebook as I wish, as I should be or could be. But when I am on there, I do notice that every now and then you're posting pictures of Kai.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, I mean, instinctively that makes sense to me, but can you just talk a little bit about, like, all of a sudden you want to share Kai? Like, what is that about? Is it a reminder to yourself? Is it a reminder to your community? Is it something came across your memory line and you're like, oh yeah, like?
Yeah, so Facebook does that lovely thing now where they remind you of your life all along the years, which was not the case when Kai was sick and dying and right after he had died. I really wasn't even on Facebook that much at that time. When Kai was sick, I was writing on the blog, and like Facebook was not what it is now, even in the past 5 years, which we all know. But yeah, I think I kind of just change it seasonally. Like, it's weird. I just think like, oh, well, I remember that picture that I really love from the fall, and I'll put that picture up. Or yeah, some event, like usually it's something else that's triggering it. I'm not thinking like, oh, I have to switch my picture, or I'm thinking about, this moment. It's more of just like, yeah, something else triggering it, like the season or an event or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's been weird. Like I've switched my profile picture. I do remember like the first time that I put up a picture that wasn't Kai. And I remember that being weird. Like, I remember that feeling weird to me. Like, oh, once I do this, I can't go back. Like, or maybe this is me moving forward, where it's a picture of me because this is my life now. Yeah. But I went back, so it's just easier. He's way cuter.
He is so freaking cute.
Yeah.
Those are half of your genes, honey. So one of the things I have found with myself is that when I look back at pictures of myself around the time when Cameron was getting very sick and it was clear that she was dying, I look at pictures of myself or videos of myself. I'm like, wow, I can't believe I did that. I recognize myself because I have a memory, and obviously that's me, but I feel like I'm looking at another me, another lifetime. Do you have that for yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I think when I look at pictures of Kai when he was a newborn, like before he was diagnosed, when I look at those pictures now, I see, and like, every new mom is exhausted, but I can see now like just how exhausting it was to try to get him diagnosed and figure out what was going on. But I think, now especially looking back at the CPN videos, I feel a lot of that, because that's not just a photo. It's like I can hear myself and I can hear the thoughts that I had at the time. And, all of those things shift over time. So it's like, I know that, like you just said, I know that that's me. And I know that that is authentically how I felt at the time. And it's also really unbelievable that those words came out of my mouth sometimes when I look at it.
So is there anything in particular, can you give a specific example of that?
I think it's just shifted over time, really. Like, I was thinking about this today, and I didn't go back and watch any of them today, which maybe I should have. But over time, it's shifted. Like, after we first recorded and you first put them up, I would watch them a lot, because it was like around the year mark, and after that first year, you're kind of coming out of this fog, and you're realizing that this time has passed. And it was very beneficial to me to have that to look back on and say, this is real, this happened, these are the things I felt at the time. And so they were really, really helpful for me in that second year, I think, especially. And then I kind of took a break from watching them for a while. And then over the years, have gone back for specific topics or having conversation with other people or remembering something. And that's when I start to look back and think, like, wow, how did I feel that? How did I say those things? Because I feel so different now. And that's weird. Like, it's a bit disorienting. And so I don't watch them as much now, because so much time has passed that, like, I know that that was who I was at the time, and those are the things I felt at the time, but it's also like all of these other things have come through my mind since then. Mm-hmm. And now it feels like a different person.
It's always true.
Yeah.
Just what is true changes.
Right.
It's not that isn't true. It was true then. It's just not how you feel now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of it is still how I feel, and that's also disorienting. Like, okay, well, now it's been 5 years and I still feel those same things, or I still don't know the answer to that question or whatever. And so that's kind of jarring too, in a way, just the reflective piece of it. Like, how far have you come? How far have you not?
Yeah.
Where is this headed?
Yeah.
It's a strange feeling sometimes.
I was thinking one of my favorite videos is when you talk about how you were a mom anticipating Kai's dying and being on the other side of it, but Kai was still alive. So you went in search of a group of people who you thought relate to you and could give you visibility into your future. Mm-hmm. And so the only group you could find was a bereavement group of people who were on the other side whose children had died, and you wanted them to tell you that you were going to be okay. And they said, we're okay. It still sucks, but we're okay. And the way you deliver that line is really, has really stayed with me. But if you imagine yourself now and you're in that bereavement group, mm-hmm. So you are a bereaved parent now in 2017, and in walks your past self, Kerri, in 2013, before Kai has died. Is there anything that you can think of that you would say to your 4-year-old yourself 5 years ago?
That I know now. What wisdom have I learned over the years?
About what you worried or what you were wondering about.
Yeah. I mean, as far as like logistical things, like I think, part of seeking out peers who have been there before is like a big part of it is the logistical things, like the actual happenings of what's going to happen. How do you make these decisions? What is it going to look like? Those were a big part of what I was looking for, which, rightfully so, a bereavement group is really not the best place to find those answers because there's all kinds of other feelings going on in a bereavement group. I think that there were times when I felt, as I was trying to figure things out at the end of Kai's life, where I felt sort of pressured to make a decision or try to figure something out as far as like funerals or, you know, do you want to die at home? Do you want to die in the hospital? And as I said in my earlier videos, I guess I still feel the same way, is that I didn't know those answers. And thankfully I didn't worry so much about them, but I would say that, like, be open to whatever possibilities, you know, might come across this path, because you don't really know what's going to happen. So there's some of this that you just can't plan for. And when I talk to parents now who are, you know, facing end of life with their children, especially when they're young, I do talk to them about, you know, it's a lot like childbirth, and, you know, there are certain things that we want to happen, and there are certain things we have to prepare for, or that we can prepare for, and then there's certain things that we can't, and they're their own being. They're their own being when they're being born, and they're their own being when they're dying. And so accepting that can sort of eliminate a lot of that potential for regret or guilt or lack of control. I was never that type of person anyway, so it was okay for me to like let some of that go. But I think it goes into bereavement too, like we were just talking about with the anniversaries, like the pressure that I put on myself to figure those things out. I guess that's what I would say. It continues, you know, there's no plan for this. There's no right way to do it. There's no wrong way to do it. And just be easy with yourself on those things. And also just, I think, accepting those feelings rather than fighting them. I think, you know, for a while, I kind of, because I didn't know the answers, would kind of get really frustrated with myself at the situation and the fact that I didn't know the answers to what I wanted to do on the 1-year anniversary. And that kind of only makes it worse. I think that's one thing that I've learned just with anxiety in general, and like sort of the lasting effects of this type of loss and trauma and all of that kind of stuff. I think accepting that there's going to be times where I'm going to feel anxious, and it doesn't mean that I'm not doing enough or that I haven't figured it out. It just means that this is how I feel right now, and you just kind of have to live with that sometimes.
And let it ride.
Yeah.
And know that it's going to pass. Because things
Yep.
time is our greatest ally in so many, in most ways.
Yep.
One of the things that we know from the literature, and that we talk a lot about at Courageous Parents Network, is the notion of decisional regret. Mm-hmm. And how when parents have regrets about decisions they made, it can complicate things. I can't remember, when I interviewed you at the time, did you have any decisional regrets? And if you did, have they passed? Have you gotten beyond them?
I think my answer when we talked about it before was that I really didn't have any regrets. And I still think, you know, on a whole, I still think I do not really live with regret about the decisions that I made. I will say, you know, over the years, it's been hard to face things like advancements in research and that kind of stuff, where, you know, being in cancer, like that's something that's always talked about. And there were many months and years in the beginning where following that research really was helpful to me to also, because I donated Kai's tumor, I felt like, and I still knew many kids in treatment, I felt some sense of purpose in that, in knowing the research and knowing the advancements and things like that. And then there were days where knowing that kind of stuff was really, really hard, and facing that, the fact that we were never going to benefit from those things was really difficult. I've never been super into research, the research side of it. I'm more of like, I need to do something now. The long term is really hard for me. But I will say I kind of actively avoid it at this point. Like, I don't need to know as much as I did in the first few years. So that was sort of one thing that I had to sort out over the years. And just working in palliative care now, I think knowing some of the options that I didn't know at the time, even though I didn't have regret about it at the time, when you find out about them later, that's caused me to have little moments of regret over the years that I actually probably wouldn't have had I not been working in palliative care now.
What's an example of that?
I think one of the things that I've sort of wrestled a little bit with over the years is just the fact of like how long I stayed. So I chose, Kai died in the hospital by choice. That in and of itself in the palliative world is sort of like, oh, well then we weren't doing a good enough job, right? So like if you're getting good palliative care, parents and patients, ideally, if they want to, should feel comfortable at home and well cared for at home. We didn't. I didn't regret that. I wanted to be in the hospital for various reasons, so I still don't regret that. But with that came him dying in the hospital and me having to walk out of that hospital. Oh, yeah. And I knew that was going to be the case. And also because we donated his tumor, I knew that there was a time limit to that. What I didn't know at the time was that time limit was longer than what I assumed.
You mean the amount of time that you could stay with Kai in the hospital? You felt like you had to rush, you had to leave earlier than.
And I didn't at the time, I did not feel rushed. But now that I've experienced that end of life process with other families who have spent many, many hours, had different process than I did, there's been times where I was like, oh, I wish I stayed a little bit longer. But I think I would always feel that way. I think we would always feel that way, that it will never be enough time. I will say, just on the technical level, wrapped up in this is also like the bathing and clothing after they pass, which was never really discussed beforehand. What the response that happened to us was our nurse, who was very committed and lovely and the perfect person for us, looked at me and said, I will take care of him. I will clean him. I will stay with him. Tell me what clothes you want to put on him, whatever, which felt very appropriate and lovely at the time. But now knowing that there are other options, that I could have done some of those things, there were little times of regret about that kind of stuff. I don't know if I would have chosen to do it anyway, but I didn't know that was an option. And so I think that's the part of the decisional regret that, any of us can kind of spin out on at various times. So it passes quickly.
That's true. It does pass quickly if you're watching this.
Yeah, it does.
That for very long. The what ifs, but they do hit you. They glance along. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah, and they're not things that you can't think of everything. No one's going to think of everything. And
overwhelming if you although when you were anticipating Kai's dying, were you reading books by anyone whose child had died already? Like, no. I was really looking for practical things because that's what everyone was telling me to deal with. But they were all in the bereavement space. It was not about the dying space. It was about the funerals and the memorial services and that kind of thing. So I think that's what, obviously really drew me to what's going on with Courageous Parents, is like, had I been exposed to some of those conversations, that's really what I was looking for. But there's no way to like search for that when you're in it, because you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know the language, and you don't know the words to search for. So I think that was the hard part of where I was at that time. All I could search for was baby urns or funeral for your kid or whatever, and that wasn't really what I was trying to figure out. So well, you have wow, You do have that. You've told me one of the things I didn't really talk about with you when I interviewed before was donating Kai's tumor. And I think you've talked about how that was meaningful to you since. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's another source of work to be done, I think, for me in my mind. When I knew that Kai was not going to survive his tumor, one of the first things I asked was about organ donation. And this was really in clinic with people who were not prepared to have this conversation with me. It was very early on. It just, that made sense to me to have some purpose. And the response was pretty quickly that that was not an option because of the tumor and because of the chemo and whatever. I've since learned, fortunately, unfortunately, that there probably were some other options that we could have explored. So again, that's one of those things that I've learned after the fact that kind of sometimes I have to check myself with. But what we did talk about was that we could donate his tumor, which seemed like at least a good second option. And once I made that decision that was what we were going to do, which was pretty easy decision for me. I know it's not an easy decision for everybody, but for me, it filled what I was asking. I really then wanted to know everything about what that would look like. And so I clearly remember a meeting early on where the PAC team was in the room with our oncologist, and Kai was sitting on my lap, and I asked the oncologist researcher to explain to me what it would be like for his tumor to be donated. And he went step by step through the whole process, which really upset the rest of the room. The rest of the room was a little bit horrified by the amount of detail he was going into. But we had a relationship at that point where he knew that that was what I was asking. And I really appreciated knowing that. And it really made some of, the regret, the twinges of regret about leaving earlier and all that kind of stuff, leaving him in the hospital. I go back to that conversation and remind myself that this is why I asked these questions, was so that I would know that this is the process and that I was accepting the full process. And so it's helpful for me to remember that. Again, it's probably not for everybody to know all those details. And it was
yourself that you're, right.
Yeah, I needed to know those things. And so the other side of that is because we donated his tumor, they do autopsy, and then we had a meeting later to discuss the findings, and that was actually it was actually a really good part of that process that I wasn't really expecting. And I've actually looked into it a lot since then about postmortem meetings with families for various reasons. Sometimes it's to find out cause of death, but often it's not. And for us, it really clarified to me just how bad this tumor was and how I really made the decisions that I had to make based off of his quality of life. It was enough time had passed where I was starting to question those things, and it made it very clear when I could see on paper how bad the tumor was, and that all of my predictions while he was alive were true. And it just really clarified things in a way that has been helpful for me over the years, for sure. And so really, in the end, wasn't even about donating the tumor, but having that information was actually really helpful. The other piece of that is that my sort of little side mission in my head that I'll someday get to is that I do think they should have more follow through with parents who decide to donate tissue for research. I've been in a lot of meetings with organ bank people, organ donation people, and I've talked to a lot of parents who have done that. And there's so much follow through, and there's so much care given to those families. And when you donate for research, it's randomized and you can't follow anything, and there's no follow up. And I hope that the researchers expand upon that, because I think they'd have a lot more success with getting people to donate if there was a little bit more care and thought put into it after the fact.
Yeah, a little more personal connection, like because it's a very intimate thing that's happened.
Right. And it matters, but when you randomize it and then it disappears into the, science, a couple of years later, that doesn't feel so great.
Yeah. You now work you work with Courageous Parents Network, and you also work part-time with the pediatric palliative care in the community where you live, in the part of Massachusetts where you live, going home in with families and doing pediatric massage, and also just really getting to know the siblings, the parents, the children. Mm-hmm. What have you observed? What can you generalize to the, I appreciate it's very dangerous to generalize. I know that if you've seen one family, you've seen one family, and every family is different. However, there are some similar themes. There are some themes that run through the family experience. And now that you are sort of a professional working with these families, not just a parent who's lived this experience yourself, and you have a very different vantage point. Most bereaved parents don't then spend a significant amount of every week with other parents with their former selves. Are there things you've observed that you want to share that you found really interesting? And then my follow-up question is, are there particular questions that you get all the time? Is there a similar sort of question you get from these parents when they know that you're a mom who's been through it? Why don't we could start with that question, like, while I eat a raisin.
Well, so a lot of them don't know. And especially, right, because I'm walking in a professional capacity. And I think especially now that 5 years has passed, in the beginning, a lot of the people I worked with did know because they knew our story, because we live in the same community. And the agency that I now work for was actually the one that cared for Kai at home as well. So it was a lot harder to separate it back then. Now, there are many families that don't know. But I do think a lot what ends up happening, even when I haven't said anything to these families or they don't previously know me from other work that I do, is that they sort of ultimately end up picking up that, like, I kind of get this, like the way I talk to them or the way I approach them or the time that I spend or the questions that I ask. Eventually, many families will end up looking at me kind of funny and being like, you know too much, like, something else is going on here. And that's often how it will come out eventually after a professional relationship has been built. I think most parents, even when they find out, are still really hesitant to ask me questions. I think what ends up happening is I have had a few situations where I've had long relationships with families where they've been afraid to ask or just not knowing what they can and can't ask. And then something big will happen or something will bubble up in their mind. And then they'll say, oh, wait, you're the person. Like, you're the person to ask this question. But I think, working in a team of palliative care providers, I don't think my answers are that different than most people who work in this space at this point. I mean, the answer is that this is different for everybody. Mm-hmm. And yes, I can empathize with some of the frustrations that happen with care or some of the just not knowing, but it doesn't mean I have the answer. I can listen and I can, I think there is some power for other people to know that I've lived it. But I try really hard to make sure that they know that just because I lived my experience doesn't mean I lived your experience, and that I want to be able to be present for that. And I am happy to share whatever would be helpful, but every situation is different. And I think, you asked about generalizing, the experience of working with other parents. And I don't think I can. Like, every single family is different. And I think what I have learned is that some families, every family is different, and some families require certain things and need certain things, and other families, those needs and requirements are very different. And so I think that's been a little bit of a struggle for me over the years, thinking about palliative care in general, where we want to kind of make this ideal situation where the family is going to have the best possible experience, the most support, be able to live with the least amount of regret. And I think that's a really tall order, because every single person is different. People within a family react differently. So I think it's almost, a very unrealistic expectation that we can kind of protect everybody from this. I think we have to sit with it and be there with them. And, I feel like I'm okay with doing that.
Yeah.
Having lived it as well.
Yeah.
But I'm thankful that I'm able to do that. And I think it's a really hard thing to do, to take myself out of it, and, I'm glad that I also worked in a hospital before I did community palliative care, because it was a lot easier to structure my role in that way and learn how to take my story out of it. And now when I'm in other people's homes, it's easier to set those. Yeah.
Oh, that makes so much sense. You've shared, without naming anybody, you've shared some little vignettes with me, and like the kids you've met and the siblings you've met and the parents we know this, but
yeah, it's the, people always, I think a lot of people in my life were very fearful of me going into this work, because it's like, don't you want to just get out of it, move on with your life, whatever? You hear all of those things. I just feel, as I know you do, and all of us who work in this, it's such a privilege to be able to be invited into that space with these families and the siblings and the parents and the children. There's really, people think this is such sad work and that it's so hard, and it's really so much the opposite, because I know that this is as intimate as it gets. Like, that if you're invited into this space, that's a very powerful relationship. And I'm thankful every time someone opens the door because I know what it's like to be on the other side of that door, and you don't always want to open it.
Yeah.
So when they do, it's an honor.
So that's actually a great segue to my very last question.
Okay.
So I named it Courageous Parents Network when I founded it, and setting aside the fact that courageous is hard to spell, or easy rather to misspell. We know why we think these families are courageous, but we also understand that families don't necessarily think of themselves as being courageous in the moment. They're just doing what they need to do. So if you could rename this organization,
oh man,
and you gave it a different adjective, something Parents Network or something Family Network, are there words that come to mind?
That's hard.
That question just came to me.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think you're right that for a lot of people, it's really hard for any of us to identify ourselves as that way, as being courageous, because this is the life we've been dealt, and we have to do it. And you know that, and I know that, and all of us know that. But I do think it's a powerful and appropriate and meaningful way to say it, because I think, as much as we all know this is our life and we have to accept it, it is difficult, and it's not typical, and it's not bad. So it's like, it's not like, it's just, it is what it is. And I guess all parents are courageous, and that is true as well. I don't know if I could think of another word. I don't know. That's a hard one.
Well, if we come up with it, we'll share.
Okay.
I don't have any more questions. Do you have anything you want to say that you haven't said yet?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, this was fun. It was
It
fun.
was
I get
fun.
to work with you every day, but now this time I got to sit across from you and talk with you for the first time after 4 years. So
Yeah.
thank
It's
you.
hard to believe that much time.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be
I adore
here.
you. Okay, we'll see later.
Okay, bye.
Bye.